Hey everybody, it's Thorn. If you are new here, please take the time to like this video, subscribe to my channel, all that good stuff. Blah, blah, blah. Find me on the internet. This is me doing self-promo. Can you tell that I don't... Anyway. So I wanted to follow up on a blog post that I just shared on Patheos yesterday called A Witch's Guide to Fountain Pens. And if you have known me for any length of time, you know that if you stand in the same room with me for longer than about 5 minutes, I will at some point whip out the dozen inked pens in my purse and force you to pretend to be interested in them and listen to me share the history of how I acquired all of them and how awesome they all are. And if you are yourself a pen enthusiast, then perhaps you understand. It's part of who I am. Fountain pens are some of my favorite things. They have absolutely changed my practice as a writer. I give my interest in fountain pens credit for much of the work I've done as an author, yada yada. Anyway, all of the cool things that are witchy about fountain pens can be found in that blog, but I wanted to follow that up with a video kind of more generally about record keeping, journaling, and writing as a magical practitioner, as a witch. This is actually part of a workshop that I do when I show up at pagan festivals. I said show up like I just invite myself and start talking in the halls, which, hey, not above. And anyway, that class is about, I think it's called Your Book of Shadows or Your Magical Journals or whatever. And it's one of my most popular classes. It's the one that I have the most fun doing because I get to sort of rely on everything that I've learned from being a classroom teacher, from being a writer, from being a coven leader, and kind of mushing that all into one class, just because I think that books and a love for books, reading, writing is actually a really big factor in many people's initial interest in witchcraft. There's that image of the witch. Think about like Winifred Sanderson with the big book, like that image of the witch with the giant grimoire that's just full of arcane secrets, right? Sally Owens and the Practical Magic Book of Shadows, like we just have this image of witches being tied kind of inherently to books. And however flawed that might be, I think that it is part of what makes witchcraft so appealing and romantic for a lot of people. But then the reality that kind of sets in for folks after that is that journaling, magical record keeping can actually feel quite daunting. And a lot of people, they have the best intentions when they start out with their own book of shadows or grimoire, and then they just don't follow through for all sorts of reasons. And I wanted to speak to that just a little bit and kind of share some tips for getting over some of the fears that go along with keeping magical records. I've made other videos about why it's important to keep magical records, so I don't want to go into that so much. This is going to be a little bit more practical. Thinking specifically about the complaints, the worries that come up over and over and over again when I do this workshop, when I'm in conversation with not just beginners but experienced practitioners. I think these problems are kind of everywhere. So the first complaint, the first worry, the first kind of fear that comes up is that my book is too nice for me, right? I imagine that a lot of you watching right now have a nice journal somewhere. Maybe you bought it for yourself, maybe it was gifted to you, and you've got it sitting somewhere totally blank and unused. Maybe it's been sitting there for years because you don't feel like you deserve it. You feel like you're gonna ruin it. You're not worth writing about in it, right? Like I've heard it all. I've done it all. I have had really gorgeous journals sit around because I was waiting for just the right way to use them. Like when I know more or when I have more to say, or, you know, oh, I'm saving that for when I do my big like herbal, like materia medica kind of, like we have all these grand plans, and experience working with other people over the years tells me that those grand plans almost never come to fruition. Like they don't happen unless you consciously choose to make them happen and go out and do them, right? That grimoire project isn't going to do itself, right? And maybe what you're telling yourself about how you'll do it later, or you'll do it when you're better, or you know more, maybe that's just an excuse to not do it at all, right? And I say that because I've been there. And so strategies for getting over that, just very practically. I think first, it's important to understand that even the most beautiful books, even the most exquisite journals and papers and, whatever, they're just books. They're just objects. They are not more important than you or better than you, or I don't know, like, you can't take them with you when you die, right? And probably nobody else is going to appreciate them as much as you do, so like, why not put them to use? And what I tell folks to do, a couple of ideas for that, a couple of things. First, I recommend just sitting down and doing something immediately on the first page. There's a couple of strategies here. One thing that's fun, if you're an artist, I recommend just spilling something on the first page. Like seriously, like a bottle of ink, your coffee, your tea, whatever, just like spill something on that first page and then find a way to turn it into art somehow, like write around it. This is an exercise that I've done with children before that's very effective with adults too. It's a way of kind of getting over that hurdle of I'm going to ruin it. If it starts out already ruined, it's much easier to write in. You can turn it into some kind of, again, if you're artistic, you can turn it into something. You could treat it kind of like sigil work, or you could divine the stains in that initial spell. Whatever kind of gets you going and fits in with your personal practice. But I think it's like ripping the tags off a new pair of clothes. Like just do it. If you just do it, then there's no choice but to keep moving forward. So that's good if you have a moment of feeling impulsive and you just kind of want to fling yourself off the cliff. Another strategy that somebody actually shared with me just yesterday that I thought was really brilliant is write on the second page. Like sometimes the reason we don't get started on that beautiful book is because we worry so much about how to get going. Like, how do I open this? Do I do a book blessing? Do I introduce myself? Do I, copy out the long version of the Wiccan Read or whatever the hell? What do? You can circumvent that pressure entirely by starting on the second or third page, whatever it is. And then you can make that choice later about how you want to introduce the book. I thought that was a really good idea. One thing that I do in my books that might be practical for some of you and also takes that pressure off is every single book that I have, all of my journals and grimoires throughout the years, all of my magical records, every single book begins with me introducing myself, just because I always imagine that I have a reader. Whether or not I ever actually do, I always imagine that my book has been sort of like found at a bus stop or something. And I start by telling that reader who I am. And that means, my craft name, how long I've been practicing, what some of my most influential books have been, if I'm practicing with other people at that time, what my goals are for the coming few years. Like, I share as much as I think is relevant or as much as I feel like in that initial page or two. I've also been known to tape in a current photograph of myself, just to sort of give context. I think anytime you're reading a journal, a memoir, a grimoire, it's helpful to know about the person writing it. So that's a strategy that I take in my own books, whether or not anybody ever does read them down the road, right? The second complaint, concern, worry, fear that people express is that their handwriting sucks. And that's something that I think most people think about themselves. And just to speak to that for a minute, I think first off, we forget that handwriting is a skill, like it's a practiced skill in the same way that people who are good at drawing or are good at music or good at anything else. One of the reasons they're good at that is because they do it all the time and they practice. If you're not practicing handwriting, if you don't do it all the time and if you don't do it with care, then your handwriting is not going to be as good as somebody who does practice. people who have really beautiful handwriting, calligraphers, your grandma, right? A lot of those folks have beautiful handwriting because they specifically were taught how and then practiced it, right? Grandparents have nice handwriting, depending on how old your grandparents are, is because in the United States, we only taught cursive and handwriting up to a point, and then we stopped. So everybody in school after that point stopped getting that training, whereas your grandparents, your great-grandparents, were taught how to write. So there's a big disparity in handwriting from decade to decade, and that correlates pretty directly with whether or not they taught handwriting in school, and we don't anymore, at least not overwhelmingly. So cut yourself some slack there, right? If your handwriting sucks, it's not because there's anything inherently flawed about you, it's because you probably haven't spent very much time cultivating the skill of handwriting. And that's not to say that you have to, it's just kind of to get rid of that fear, that hurdle maybe a little bit, right? It's a skill. It's not something that is inborn. You're good at it or you aren't. So that's the first bit. The more you write, the better your handwriting will get. My handwriting has improved dramatically in recent years as I've done more writing by hand, as I've shifted up the kinds of pens I use, because that stuff matters. The material that you use also impacts the product. So something to think about. If your ballpoint pen sucks and hurts your hand, it's not necessarily because writing is terrible, it's because ballpoint pens kind of suck, right? They're not designed for that long form writing, especially in cursive. So something to think about. The second thing I want to throw out to you is that magical communities are full of luminaries with terrible handwriting, right? Like you could name practically any tradition, think about some of the sacred texts that are floating around, and people have atrocious handwriting. I don't know if you've ever seen Aleister Crowley's handwriting, but it's basically illegible. Gerald Gardner is even worse. Ray Buckland, terrible handwriting. Alex Sanders, abysmal, right? If you see facsimiles of their work, or if you have the opportunity to see original manuscripts, their handwriting is trash, okay? And I'd be willing to bet that most of your favorite authors, teachers, have trash handwriting, and yet they still produce amazing materials. So again, like maybe cut yourself some slack. If your handwriting is awful, that doesn't mean that the book itself won't be powerful, beautiful, valuable. The third thing that I wanted to touch on is this concern that you're just not magical or interesting enough. Again, I think one of the reasons why the book sits empty is because we feel like there's something that's just fundamentally inherent in ourselves that makes us not worth writing about or sharing our ideas. And to that, I say that history is made by everyday people. I think the way we learn about things in school, the way we read about things, we tend to focus on like big, larger than life figures. But so much of what we know about the world is the result of looking at artifacts, including texts, left by people who were basically no one. Right? We don't know the authors, we don't know who owned this pot or who lived in this house or whatever, but so much of what we know is the result of everyday people just living their lives. And when I sit down to journal, I think about that every time. I think like, you don't know what you're going to leave behind, whether you mean to or not. And to me, that's very exciting. This idea that my voice kind of can float off and become part of this collective moment in our history, and that in the future it might matter. I think that that's really incredible. I think it's a privilege, and it gets me excited to write, even if what I'm writing about I think is just like impossibly mundane in the moment. Like it's fascinating. The other point to that is that we're not really great judges on how interesting or magical we are. Like, I think most people, I don't know if this is just cultural or like I don't know what it is, okay? But I think most people suffer from a lack of confidence. I think we're kind of taught to doubt ourselves, to dismiss ourselves. And like you can't just snap out of that. Like it takes years, I think, to overcome those kinds of impulses. But trust me, you are a terrible judge of how valuable your thoughts are. And I ask that you give yourself the benefit of the doubt when you're sitting down to document your magical practice, your thoughts, your relationship with your gods or your spirits, your tradition, whatever. Because again, like, you don't know what's going to end up being important to you down the road, or anybody who might be exposed to your text later. So that's part of it. Like, dismissing yourself, I think, is something that is really deeply entrenched in all of us, and it's something that takes a lot of effort to get over. So again, like, give yourself some grace there. The other thing to add is that there are lots of reasons to keep a journal. I've focused, to me, it's most interesting to think about, like, people who might read it later, but that's not the only reason to keep a journal, and it's not the reason why most people keep journals, I think. Most people, I think, keep journals because they're reflective tools. They serve us. So if your journal, if your grimoire, your book of shadows is about serving you, then the point is not to be entertaining to other people or to be remarkably witchy or more magical than somebody else. The point is to start wherever you are and then develop into wherever else you want to be in the future. So your journal, your book of shadows, your magical records, this is a tool that is this living thing that pushes you forward and helps you to grow, which means that you don't have to be awesome to use it, right? Like, we all kind of suck. And putting that suck somewhere, looking at it, developing it, figuring out where we want to go next, that's one thing that journaling is really good for. So if you're not magical enough or interesting enough, or you don't have a good sense of who you are as a witch, that makes you normal. Like, that makes you, I think, like, we all have those kinds of fears and worries. And the point of that magical record keeping is to push yourself forward. The expectation isn't that you are the embodiment of the craft that you want in this moment. Like, they're very much living, breathing things that change over time. So I have a lot of words about books. You can see I can keep going. Like, but I hope those things are helpful. If you haven't checked out the blog, I'll put the link below. It's primarily about pens and tools, kind of as magical tools. I hope you all are well, and I will see you next time.